Hello, friends, and welcome to my today's lecture on the second part of Oscar Wilde, The Irish Playwright. In my earlier part, or the first part, I had mentioned Oscar's full name as Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, an Irish poet, wit, and a dramatist, and that he had also earned his fame from his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and two comic masterpieces, as I had mentioned, Lady Windermere's Fan and The Importance of Being Earnest. I had also mentioned that Oscar Wilde was a spokesperson for the modern aesthetic movement in England, which had advocated the very famous phrase, art for art's sake. I had also talked about Oscar Wilde's parentage, about his parents both being professionals and literary, as both of them were writers, though his mother later on, after getting married, had sacrificed writing for the sake of being fully devoted and preserving the marriage. And since she wanted to devote her complete time to the family, she left writing altogether. And I had even quoted Walt Pater's urging in quotes to burn always with a hard gem-like flame, which acted rather as an influence on Oscar Wilde. And also the other influence that Oscar carried was of John Ruskin, besides Walter Pater, and how sensitive Oscar was that when he lost his sister Isola, in order to show his sensitiveness, he wrote a poem, Requisite, and then that he had received his education from Trinity College and Magdalen College and came out with a degree in honors. And I had also mentioned how things went against him and how people wrote, even in the artistic circles, people were opposed to him and they wrote satirist articles against him. But in spite of all that, he stood quite firm, and in order to establish his identity, he wrote a collection of poems in 1881 and showed that he was a true disciple to poets like Swinburne, Rossetti and John Keats. And he even exhorted the Americans to love beauty and art, and later on he returned to Great Britain to lecture on his impressions of America. Now today I'll be talking about the remaining part of that short biographical note on Oscar Wilde. Now in 1884, Oscar married Constance Lloyd, who was the daughter of an Irish barrister, and he had blessed with two children, Cyril and Vivian, in the years 1885 and 1886. Now, meanwhile, Oscar Wilde He wrote reviews for the Pall Mall Gazette, and then he became the editor of Woman's World from 1887 to 1889. Now, during this time, he published his book, The Happy Prince and the Other Tales, in the year 1888, which shows that how much he loved romantic allegory, and in the form of fairy tales it was shown. In the last 10 years of his life, before he died rather on November 30th, 1900, in Paris, France. In those last years of his life, he wrote all his major works. In The Picture of the Dorian Gray, which was published in 1891, he combined the supernatural elements of the Goethe novel with the unspeakable sins of the French decadent fiction. The critics of his times, they called him immoral, though Dorian was self-destructed. But Wilde still insisted on the moral nature of art, regardless of the moral endings. His another collection or another work of his Intentions, which is published in 1891, it consisted of previously published essays, restated his aesthetic attitude towards art by borrowing ideas from French poets like Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire, and even an American painter, James McNeill. He also wrote 2 volumes of stories and fairy tales in the same year, 1891, when The Picture of Dorian Gray was published. Now, these 2 volumes of stories and fairy tales, it shows how creative Wilde was. Lord Arthur Savile's Crime and Other Stories and A House of Pomegranates were also during this time. But Oscar Wilde's success lied in society comedies. Lady Windermere's Fan, it was the first comedy which was written by Oscar, and it showed wit as a dominant factor. A second society comedy was A Woman of No Importance, which was published in the year 1893, and his final plays were An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, which was published in 1895, and even the essay The Decay of Lying in 1889. Now, Oscar was arrested in the year 1895, and he was ordered to stand trial when he sued for criminal libel, and evidence went against him, and he dropped the suit. Now there was a retrial, and in that retrial, again he was found guilty, and he was sentenced in May 1895 for 2 years imprisonment at hard labor. Now in the year 1897, after he completed his 2 years of imprisonment, he was released from jail, and he was totally bankrupt, and he went to France to rejuvenate himself as a writer. Now, his leftover work that was there, the Ballad of Reading Jail, which was published in 1898, that revealed his concern basically for the inhumane conditions that were prevalent in the prison. And even though he had no money at the time when he came out of the jail, he tried to maintain and, in quotes, we can say, the unconquerable gaiety of soul, unquote. And towards the end, we see that ultimately he died suddenly of acute meningitis, which was brought on to him by ear infection. And in his final moments, he was received by the Roman Catholic Church, which he had long admired during his lifetime. Now, that was all about Oscar Wilde's biographical note. In my next few lectures, I'll be talking about Oscar Wilde's important society comedy, or you can say important comedy, The Importance of Being Earnest, for which he received great fame and acclaim. That's all for now. Thank you and goodbye, friends.